This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 1st, 1938, 250,000 people gather in Barcelona, Spain, to bid farewell and give their thanks to the masses of foreign volunteers who had come to Spain over the previous years to fight in and otherwise support the Spanish Civil War. These were left-leaning men and women from all over the globe coming to the Popular Front cause in its battle against conservative forces led by Francisco Franco, who would of course go on to be Spain's dictator in the decades after this moment. We've gotten a number of requests to talk about this moment, the young men and women who chose to go join the Spanish cause, many of them from the United States, coming together in groups that would be given names like the Lincoln Battalion or the John Brown Battalion. A special shout out to listener Matt in particular, who wrote us a bunch of ideas about this and really prompted it. And I've also mentioned on this show my fascination with this moment, and in particular how after visiting Spain the summer before last, I read this beautiful book called Spain in Our Hearts, Americans in the Spanish Civil War. And guess what? We have the author of that book today as our special guest, the legendary writer and journalist Adam Hochschild. There's far too much to list here, but Adam is the author of King Leopold's Ghost, co-founder of Mother Jones Magazine. Last year's book was American Midnight, about America in the period just after the First World War. He has won every award there is to win. But Adam, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real honor, and thank you for writing Spain in Our Hearts. I really, really loved it.
Oh, thank you, Jody. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad you're marking this anniversary.
Yeah. And here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Adam, before you tell us, and you paint such a beautiful picture of this, of why it is that young American men and women feel inspired to go to Spain, but just out of curiosity, you know, they call themselves the Lincoln Battalion. What's going on there? Who decides that? Why are they doing that?
Well, there were more than 35,000 volunteers from over 50 countries who went to fight in Spain starting in 1936 because it seemed to be the one place in the world where there was actually a military struggle against fascism going on. Because Francisco Franco and his so-called Spanish nationalists were being heavily aided by Hitler and Mussolini, who were sending guns, tanks, planes, troops, submarines to help his forces take over Spain. And for people all over the world who cared passionately about fighting fascism, this was the place where the battle seemed to be taking place. Among those international volunteers, there were some 2,800 Americans, 750 of whom would never come home. They were killed in Spain. They initially formed themselves into a unit called the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. When a second battalion was formed, it was called the George Washington Battalion. The reason for these very patriotic-sounding names, I think, was that the majority of the Americans who went to fight in Spain were members of the Communist Party or its affiliated groups, and they wanted to portray themselves, despite that label, as being as patriotic and as all-American as possible. There was a joke of that time, which was, how do you tell somebody who's a member of the Communist Party Youth League, it's because he's the only person around who knows the second and third verses of the national anthem, which the rest of us never learned. So they picked these names. Eventually, the George Washington Battalion got pretty much wiped out in combat, and its members were merged into the Lincoln Battalion. And today, they use the word Lincoln Brigade to refer to all of those 2,800 Americans who went to Spain, who included many people who were not in that battalion, but who were doctors, nurses, worked in other areas.
I'm curious because we have Kellie here who's written about abolitionism and violence. I mean, the other name that came up here was John Brown and the John Brown Battalion. Kellie, how do you make sense of that?
I know. I love a good appropriation of a, of a freedom fighter name. I think that, it's funny that it's not just like a John Brown Brigade that you see in Spain, but you see John Brown also invoked in like Haiti and after the Haitian Revolution, like his name pops up. There's like a John Brown Road that goes through like Port-au-Prince. And so I always think about like how these names get placed, or even statues and memorials or things of that nature get reappropriated again. I think it's a way of keeping like that, I don't know, rebellious sort of patriotic spirit alive. I mean, patriot depends on how you look at the person's views, but I don't know. I think about those things a lot, how they get exported around the world.
John Brown's probably the closest, right, to all these young men and women, just in terms of ideology and disposition, right?
Well, and these were also interracial brigades, which is something that wasn't happening in the United States. It wasn't happening in other foreign wars that the U.S. was involved in. Adam, how do you explain or make sense of the fighting side by side of black and white soldiers?
Well, you have to give some credit to the Communist Party. Much as I disagree with so many other aspects of their ideology, they were one of the very few organizations in the United States at that time that believed that there should be no racial discrimination whatever. And they always, there were black and white members of Communist Party cells. There were doubtless both black and white FBI informers inside those cells, because we know that a fairly high percentage of Communist Party membership were FBI informers. And when they went to Spain, these units were integrated. The U.S. military, of course, was not integrated at that time. That didn't start to happen until 1948. But there were more than 70 black Americans who fought in Spain. One of them, very briefly, was the commander of the Lincoln Battalion, but he was killed in combat some 3 days after he was appointed. Mm-hmm. It's very moving to see these pictures of black and white Americans fighting side by side and, working together, of equal rank, doing things that would not happen in the U.S. military and would not happen almost anywhere else in the United States at that time.
You mentioned the role of the Communist Party in here. I just think it's worth kind of pointing out, we've tried to do this on this show, but, to be a communist in the United States evolves really quickly and means a lot of different things in the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, and obviously into the 50s. And so can you just talk a little bit about, in this particular moment, what the appeal of communism was and what kind of young idealistic person was attracted to that and then in turn attracted to going to Spain to join this cause?
That's a good question. I think it has to do with, we first have to sort of set the context of the world being in the Great Depression. Here was the greatest economic slump the world had ever seen. Here in the United States, the beginning of the 1930s, a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Another quarter was underemployed, just working part-time when they needed to be working full-time. There were people living in hundreds of thousands of people living in shack settlements that sprang up everywhere, people who'd been evicted from their homes and apartments because they couldn't pay rent or couldn't pay mortgage. There were tens of thousands of young men riding railroad boxcars back and forth across the country fruitlessly in search of work. Long lines of people outside soup kitchens. The U.S. had never seen anything like this. And I think it's no surprise that people then, many people in the United States sort of put their hopes in this ideal that was supposedly being expressed in another country far away, the Soviet Union, which, as far as anybody could tell from the news media, was not suffering from a depression, didn't have unemployment, didn't have soup kitchen lines and so on. So they must be doing something right over there. Now, of course, there were many barriers to really understanding what was going on in the Soviet Union at that time. And I think it wasn't until the late 1930s when there were the well-publicized purge trials of, Stalin's enemies being dispatched first by the dozens, then by the hundreds, then by the hundreds of thousands to the execution cellars or the Gulag that many people began to feel disillusioned. Also, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, and this was clearly a case of a chance to fight against the advance of fascism, the principal democratic countries, the United States, Britain, and France, all refused to sell arms to the Spanish Republic, the government that was being attacked, which was a democratically elected government. Stalin, then head of the Soviet Union, sort of hoped the Western democracies would do so when, after 3 or 4 months, they did not. He said to the Spanish Republic, okay, I'll sell you the arms that you need, but you have to pay me dearly for them. And in return, I want you to install Soviet and Spanish communists in high positions in your army and the government. And that's what happened. So this was the only major nation that was helping the Spanish Republic. And I think it's no surprise that the U.S. Communist Party enjoyed a big surge of membership during this time.
So can you talk about that? Is there like a typical prototype person that decides, hey, I want to do this. I'm going to like go to Spain? Because the thing is, you couldn't actually go directly to Spain from the United States. You had to go through France because the United States government wasn't issuing, passports or visa because they weren't trying to get into the fray. But, what kind of person decides to make that choice?
Well, I say in my book that if there was a typical American volunteer in the Spanish Civil War, he was, and I say he because all but 70 or 80 people were men. The women were nurses. He was from the greater New York area. He was Jewish. He was a first or second generation immigrant, and he was a member of the party or one of its affiliated groups. There were lots of people, though, who didn't fit that description, who came from other parts of the country, graduates of Ivy League colleges, extremely poor people, black and white, from the South, from other parts as well. But the volunteers, about half of them came from the greater New York area, which was actually the place where the Communist Party was strongest, where the left-wing traditions that recent immigrants had brought from Europe were strongest.
But you list those things of what he typically would be from the New York area, Jewish, member of the Communist Party. On that list is probably not knows how to shoot a gun or dress a wound in the field,
Yeah.
Well, they were hastily put through training, and some of the American volunteers were rushed into battle after only a few weeks of training, where they often had no adequate rifles or bullets to train with. And they were slaughtered in huge numbers in the opening days of the war. Things got a little bit better after that. There was more training. But people were rushed into battle with no experience, no sense of what it would be like, because the Spanish Republic was desperate. In the fall of 1936, Franco's forces, the Spanish nationalists, heavily aided by Germany and Italy, reached the edge of Madrid, the capital, and it looked as if the city was going to fall. And it was at that moment that the first international volunteers arrived. And you can imagine, what a moving experience this was for the citizens of Madrid who had been being bombed by these. This was the first major aerial bombardment of a Western capital. Were being bombed by these German and Italian bombers, and then seeing marching down the city street, coming out of the train at a railroad station and walking directly to the front, volunteers from, England, France, Italy, other countries who were coming to help them. So this was a tremendous boost in morale for the Spanish Republic. And these international volunteers, at that point, not yet Americans among them, but the Americans would come very soon, fought in defense of Madrid. And the front line actually went directly through the outskirts of the city. They went through the university, which was on the northwest part of the city. And there are actually people, international volunteers in one university building firing at Franco's troops in another university building. So this was a desperate battle, and Madrid held out to the very end of the war, but gradually Franco's troops seized almost the entire rest of the country.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I wanted to ask a question about honor in terms of what happens when you have these large casualties of people that are not Spanish, that are coming from other countries. Are they buried in Spain? Do they go back home? Are they honored by the government in Spain?
That's a good question, because I would say they were honored in Spain and dishonored in the United States. People in the Spanish Republic were desperately pleased that these volunteers from all over the world had come to help them. And this day that we're commemorating in 1938, which was the farewell parade of the internationals as they left Spain, 300,000 people thronged the streets of Barcelona to cheer these foreign volunteers, including Americans, who had come there to fight for Spanish democracy. And you can see films and photographs of that parade. It's an immensely moving thing. As soon as they got home, the FBI was after them. J. Edgar Hoover was in charge of the FBI then, as he was for, almost half a century. And he viciously pursued these vets year after year in the coming decades. If he tracked where they went, and if a Spanish Civil War veteran got a new job, the FBI would send a couple of agents to go call on his employer and say, "Are you aware that one of your employees once served in a communist army?" So these veterans tended to keep very quiet, keep quite a low profile. And really that began to change only in the late 1960s, when, to their amazement and delight, when veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade began marching in demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, they heard themselves cheered by younger Americans who knew what they had done meant.
I want to stay in that moment in 1938 that we're commemorating today for just a minute more, to make sense of the sort of retreat or the leaving of these soldiers at the end of the war. Can you help walk us through what that moment was like? Was there a formal moment of defeat? Was there an agreement that they would leave? What builds up to this moment when everyone is heading out of Spain?
Well, here's what happened. Fall of 1938, October of 1938, it was clear that the Spanish Republic was doomed. They were desperately trying to hold on, knowing, as did almost everybody at that point, that World War II was going to start fairly soon. And they hoped that if they could just hold on, then finally the United States, Britain, and France would come to their aid, because they would be fighting Hitler, and Hitler was supporting General Franco. By October of 1938, the international forces, the international volunteers in Spain, were reduced to only a few thousand survivors. So many had been killed, so many had been wounded. And they were pretty bedraggled and not a significant military force anymore. And the government of the Spanish Republic hoped that if they publicly declared that we are thanking the international brigades for their service and sending them home, that then the Western democracies would put pressure on Hitler and Mussolini to stop aiding General Franco. So they made this gesture of saying to the international volunteers, "Thanks, we're sending you home." They staged this farewell parade. 300,000 people thronged the streets of Barcelona. But it didn't produce the reaction they wanted. The Western democracies were still not willing to put that kind of pressure on Hitler and Mussolini.
You talked a little bit about the reception that this group got when it came back to the United States, but it seems like this sort of scrambles political lines a little bit in the United States, because on the one hand, I think they come home, they get painted as communist. And I mean, I think I read an interview with Ronald Reagan in like the 80s where he basically says, yeah, most Americans were against what these communists were up to going over to Spain to fight that war. But they were fighting a war against forces that were aligned with Hitler and Mussolini, who we were fighting in World War II.
Well, I think their status probably did increase a good deal once the United States entered World War II, because suddenly it was clear that at this point in history, fascism was the real enemy. And there were more than 400 veterans of fighting in Spain, American veterans of fighting in Spain, who enlisted in the U.S. military. If their commanders in their unit were smart, they knew that these were folks who had military experience, knew how to fire a gun, and so on. And some of them were put into very responsible positions. In other cases, the fact that somebody had been a Communist Party member or whatever meant that he was peeling potatoes for most of the war. So there was sort of a mixed reaction. The most moving story there comes from a guy who was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, who was in the OSS, that parachuted people behind enemy lines to, help the guerrillas and so forth in Europe. And he was parachuted behind lines to help the Italian partisans in Italy who were fighting against the Germans. And at one point, and he writes about this in his memoirs, he was negotiating with an Italian partisan leader who was quite suspicious of him because these partisans were left-wingers and, who were these Americans who'd been dropped into their midst. And as he was struggling to communicate with this man, he kept using Spanish words, which he had learned in Spain. And then the Italian guy's face lit up and said, "Were you in Spain?" And the American said, "Yes, I was." And it turned out they had both fought in the defense of Madrid. So little moments of solidarity like that, I find it very sweet.
You do such a great, beautiful job of sort of tracing those ties and how people sort of intersected in and out of each other in the run up to this, during the war, and then in the years after. As we wrap up, do you have thoughts on Delmer Berg, the last surviving member who died just not that many years ago?
That's right. He was believed to be the last surviving American last surviving American volunteer who died a few years ago, but actually somebody discovered there was another American, which they hadn't known about, who lived a year or two longer, but he was not in the records because he'd been living in France. But I honor these folks. One of the reasons why I wrote the book, Spain in Our Hearts, was because I had the pleasure of knowing several of the American volunteers quite well many years ago, because these were people who were 30, 40 years older than I was. And the first volunteers I met were when I was in my early 20s. I was working as a newspaper reporter in San Francisco, and the newspaper I was working for, San Francisco Chronicle, was quite good about hiring people who might have been blacklisted from jobs elsewhere. And they defied the FBI, and two of the reporters on the staff, again, 30, 40 years older than me, were veterans of the Spanish Civil War.
Wow.
And when things were slow in the city room, I would ask them about their experiences. And then as the years went past, my wife and I got to know two other volunteers who lived here in California quite well. And this was something that made me curious to learn more about the war.
I love that. I love that it also compelled you to write a book, too.
Yeah.
Most people would just take those relationships as they are, but to be able to sort of tell their story is remarkable.
Well, on that front, and as final question as we wrap up, but I'm just curious, it does seem like you're really deeply interested in that between the wars period, or maybe even more specifically, the aftermath of World War I. I'm just curious why you feel like you found yourself writing about that, why you feel like it's resonant to now, and then also if there's any stories that we should cover on this show going forward from that period.
Well, I have to admit I'm writing another book about the Between the Wars period right now. I've always been fascinated by the First World War and its after effects. The historian Simon Schama talks about World War I as the original sin of the 20th century, because so many of the things that have caused such a violent century came out of it. The war not only, killed some 9 million soldiers, and depending on how you count them, perhaps an even greater number of civilians, but it virtually guaranteed there would be a Second World War because of the reservoir bitterness and resentment in Germany, particularly. It also gave birth to the Russian Revolution and all of the subsequent misery that the Soviet Union involved. I think, Tsarist Russia couldn't have lasted forever, but I can certainly imagine it changing in less violent and harmful ways than happened in the Soviet Union. So that period has always been, had a certain magnetism for me. And I wrote one book, To End All Wars, about World War I as it affected the British, because there was a very vibrant, colorful, interesting anti-war movement there. And to see people in the midst of this terrible war realizing that it was going to remake the century for the worse in every possible way was exciting to me. So I keep coming back to it, and maybe come back again.
Adam, I think you come back to tell the stories of the people who have been silenced and the people who have been marginalized. I was just saying before we got on about how I used King Leopold's ghost, but telling the stories of the people whose narratives are often not heard or known is also such a great component to revealing esoteric history, but giving voice and value to those people's lives, I think, is really meaningful and important.
Oh, thank you, Kellie. It's certainly what I try to do, because there's such a tradition of people who are trying to write history for a general audience, writing about the people we already know about and already honor. And one thing you will never find me doing, I promise, is writing another book about the Founding Fathers. We've got enough of those already.
I was just thinking that this is the closest you've ever gotten to name-checking Lincoln and George Washington, right? It's writing about the Lincoln Brigade.
Right.
Well, look, Adam Hochschild, thank you so much for doing this. Thanks for all your work, but this has been really fascinating, and we really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. Good luck to all of you.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.